Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Palmer. Tonight I'm speaking with Professor Junko Habu, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Berkeley. Professor Habu?
Thank you for inviting me.
Nice to have you here. So you're an expert on the Jomon, the indigenous of Japan, and you've written a couple of books about it.
Yes. Let me tell you briefly about the Jamon period. It's a name for the prehistoric hunter-gatherer culture in Japan, which lasted from about 16,000 years ago to about 2,500 years ago. So it's over 10,000 years of time span. And they are what we call complex hunter-gatherers, which means that they had fairly sedentary settlements. They made complex features and material cultures, and they're very different from the typical image of mobile hunter-gatherers.
Their pottery was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's one of the things that attracted attention of many archaeologists worldwide, because they're quite unusual. They're very artistic, and especially those that were produced at around 5,000 years ago. They're very dynamic, and I think that appealed to a large number of people outside of Japan.
Is that some of the earliest known ceramics?
The oldest pottery in that region, well, the oldest pottery from Jamon Site is dated to about 16,000 years ago. That's one of the oldest. There are some that are slightly older than the dates, but it's based on the radiocarbon dates, and usually you have to take the 2 sigma range, and if you take the 2 sigma range, they do overlap. So they're one of the oldest examples, yes.
Their settlements were very complex, almost like small cities?
By the early Jomon period, which is about 6,000 years ago, we see large settlements associated with tens of pit dwellings, sometimes even over 100. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they were fully sedentary, and that's where the question comes, that a lot of people assume that sedentary life is more advanced, and one of the issues that we are dealing with is, for hunter-gatherers, was full sedentism more advanced or not? And in a way, we see that some advantages as well as problems associated with sedentism occurred. Even at that time, we have some parasite eggs, which means that the hygiene condition was not necessarily optimum. So in that regard, some of the problems associated with large cities were already present at that time.
Usually, hunter-gatherers become sedentary due to some horticulture developing. In their case, was that the case with the Jamon, or was it the case that they just had so many resources around them that they could stay put?
That is a very good question. We do have some plant remains that we think were cultigens, but none of them seem to have been staple food. We have bottle gourd, which must have been valued as containers. We have egoma mint, which is like basil. And again, that cannot be staple food. We have a very small amount of beans, but I don't think that was staple food either. So they knew how to cultivate plants, but that wasn't part of their staple food. Now, do we want to call them agriculturalists or not? That is a big question, but it's quite clear that their main staple food source was hunting, gathering, was coming from hunting, gathering, and fishing.
Well, the fact that they developed pottery so early, usually it's for vessels. And you don't need vessels unless you have surplus.
Well, yes and no.
So they could be ceremonial.
Surplus is tied to the issue of storage, and the Jomon people had large storage pits. The vessels, they're very useful for cooking, for water, etc. So they're not necessarily tied to surplus.
I see. Now, there was a huge Jamon site discovered not long ago, or
the Sane Maruyama site?
Yeah, northeast Japan. And you worked on that site?
Yes, that was excavated initially by local Board of Education of Aomori Prefecture, and it was supposed to be a baseball stadium, but it turned out to be that the entire planned stadium area was a huge Jomon settlement. And local people took pride of the fact that the site was found in their hometown. And the prefectural governor decided to preserve the site. And we joined their excavations every summer from 1997 to 2007.
And what did you find?
We found a lot of plant seeds. We are looking at organic remains. The site itself is so huge.
It's a middle period?
It's what we call the early and the middle Jomon periods. So it's dated to about 5900 to 4300 years ago. And because it was occupied for over 1500 years, obviously the site went through a number of changes. It's just like from the 5th century to the present. You cannot imagine any single village on the earth today that had no functional changes for 1500 years. So we are pretty sure that it went through a lot of changes, but nevertheless, the size is quite amazing.
How many people lived in this
The big debate is, some people say that it was occupied with over 500 people. Other people think that it might have been occupied with 500 people, but not necessarily throughout the year. Mm-hmm. There's a possibility that if you're looking at hunter-gatherer ethnographic examples, there are a number of cases where a lot of people gathered for a couple of months for social gatherings and but not necessarily living there for the full year. So
did you find religious figurines?
Yes, there are a lot of what we call clay figurines, and that site is associated with the largest number of figurines.
And what is their shape?
The ones from this particular site is actually very characteristic, that it looks like flat tablets that are what we call, it's like a cross-shaped, but the face and hands and the basic body characteristics are quite clear.
What were the characteristics of their religion?
Well, you know, archaeologists are notorious for assigning things as religious or ceremonial items, and that means we don't really know what kind of rituals these people conducted. But we do have these figurines. We do have what we call stone circles, which are definitely associated with ceremonial functions. They are, for the Middle Jomon period, they are associated with burials. So for sure, they were closely tied with their religious perspectives.
So they did have rituals surrounding burial?
Definitely.
Yeah. Was there hierarchy?
Up to the end of the Middle Jomon period, we do not really think that social hierarchy was quite clear. That we do have some differences in terms of burials, some ornaments, but I don't think they were hierarchically structured. Or even if they were, there was some hierarchical structure, I don't think that was hereditary. For the late and final Jomon period, there might have been some weak social stratification, but again, I don't think it was as clear as in the case of the Northwest Coast or part of California.
Is there evidence of patriarchy? Can you tell those things?
Not really.
No. It seems that Jomon, the Japanese have a different relationship to their indigenous than many other peoples, European peoples and American peoples. You relate to your indigenous people, and you feel like they are your ancestors. These aren't people that were run over by another culture and displaced. It seems that, well, in your book on the Jomon, you mentioned that in Japan, archaeology is seen more as history, and you would like to have that be the case, perhaps in elsewhere.
Right.
correct?
Well, Japanese archaeology is unique in the sense that it's considered as the study of the Japanese people's own ancestors. So people are very enthusiastic about learning the past through archaeology. And it is also tied to the history of Japan that during the Second World War, the ultranationalistic ideology assumed that the Japanese nation was established by the ancestors of the imperial family. And if you take that interpretation, then there's no way to suggest that the prehistoric hunter-gatherers resided in Japan. You know, the imperial family's ancestors could not have been hunter-gatherers. So what happened was during the Second World War, archaeologists were able to study Jomon potsherds, but they couldn't talk about the interpretations of these remains. And after the Second World War, for the first time, archaeologists were able to talk about the presence of hunter-gatherers and the reconstructions of the lifeways of the Jomon people. So the studies of Jomon hunter-gatherers and the following Yayoi early agricultural farmers, they became the symbols of the new era of Japan, free from ultranationalistic ideology. Science and archaeological studies became a tool to really understand what really happened in Japan in the past. And that symbolized the democratic Japan.
So that had broad cultural ramifications.
Right.
Wow, interesting.
And it's also the case that in Japan it is okay to study skeletal remains. And there are lots of photos, and it's their own ancestors. Therefore, there are no equivalent of NAGPRA in North America. That we do pay respect to skeletal remains, but there are no. The situation is very different from the case in North America. That in North America, we archaeologists, we are very careful about dealing with skeletal remains. We do talk with Native Americans who may be related to the remains. And we do have our research plans in close collaboration with various stakeholders.
You mentioned that the Jomon period ended at 2500 BCE.
Yes, BP, before present.
Yeah, oh, I see.
So about
right.
500 BP, I mean BC.
BC.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Does anything exist verbally, verbal traditions, verbal stories that were handed down?
Nothing that is clearly related to that period, but skeletal remains studies indicate that the present Japanese population is a mixture of two types of Asian populations, what we call an archaic type of Asian population and the new type of Asian population. And the new type is considered to be tied to the Yayoi culture. So the idea is that Jomon people is more closely tied to what we call the archaic type of Asian population. And the new type of population, a large number of immigrants came to the Japanese archipelago at around 2,500 years ago. And the present Japanese mainland population is a mixture of the two populations.
Now, another large concern for you is nuclear power in Japan. You were involved in that issue before the earthquake, and you happen to have been in Japan during the earthquake. Would you like to speak about that?
Yes. Let me tell you that my research of the Jomon period, I was always interested in the correlations between subsistence, diversity, population, the degree of sedentism, social network, trade, etc. So in that context, I was always interested in human-environmental interactions. And for a long time, my archaeology was interested in that topic and my political interest in environmental issues in contemporary Japan and contemporary world. These were kind of two different issues. Now, over the past 3 or 4 years, I began to see that my work on the Jomon period actually could be tied to contemporary issues. And then the earthquake hit Japan. And that really was a trigger to make me think that I really need to think about the way to link the two issues. And let me tell you that the earthquake and the following Fukushima disaster, these are serious problems. I am very unhappy with what happened. At the same time, a lot of people told us that the nuclear power plant situation in Japan was so problematic that sooner or later we would have encountered with some kind of problems anyway.
The design flaws.
The design flaws. Japan is an earthquake country. There was Kashiwazaki Kariwa accident. Several years ago, there was an earthquake which almost led to a major disaster. It didn't, but it was clear that nuclear power plants in Japan are problematic and they are not really ready for earthquakes. And then this happened. And what happened in Fukushima was disastrous. But if we cannot stop nuclear power plants after this, then we are really in big trouble.
Well, for now, they have been halted.
Right. Currently, there are no nuclear power plants that are running in Japan, that all of them are stopped. And, but there are quite a number of people who are still claiming that we do need nuclear power plants for the next several decades until we can find an alternative energy source. The problem is, by running nuclear power plants, we are actually accumulating more spent nuclear fuel rods. And it's quite clear that processing spent nuclear fuel rods is a big problem. And we've already accumulated so many of them that some people said that we have to basically babysit them for the next 100,000 years. Now, as an archaeologist, I deal with long-term sustainability. And I'm suggesting that when we talk about long-term sustainability, we really need to think about several hundreds to several thousand years from now. But even with that, 100,000 years, that's an ridiculously long term. And we cannot afford to accumulate more nuclear spent fuel.
And we're burdening the future and just continuing to do that without a long-term plan.
Right. So we do really need long-term plans. And I believe that we archaeologists can contribute to think about long-term plans. I have a pilot project with a group of Japanese scholars about thinking about long-term sustainability and think about the scale of society and economy. And one of the issues that I am very interested in is the correlation between food diversity, biodiversity, the scale of economy, and long-term sustainability. And looking at archaeological data, it seems that small-scale operations are actually very functional, that it's economically efficient, that if you have a number of small-scale operations, individual operations may not be able to sustain a large population, but they are much more stable. And also, if one of them collapses, you have backups. And even if they are small, if they are networked together, then as a whole, it can function as a large-scale system, but you have a number of different small scales.
We're going in the opposite direction.
Right. And the problem is, number one, if we are going to the opposite direction, then you're homogenizing all the units, which means that if there's a problem with that, then the whole thing will collapse. And also, if you are connecting everything, then we might have just one gigantic system. And if that one gigantic system collapses, then you may not have a backup. So we may be facing a big problem, and I'm hoping that archaeology can prove that that is not a good way to go.
So you feel that archaeologists are in a position to articulate to the general public the long-term, you're used to thinking long-term looking back.
Right.
And you can apply those same things looking forward and
Yes.
say, well, these things don't work.
Correct.
Looking forward, this is not sustainable, and so we need more individual units, more redundancy,
Right.
and smaller units, more human scale.
Right.
You know, and that makes sense on just many levels.
I believe so. For example, I think in California there are a number of organic farmers, and if you go to farmers market, you see a lot of them are doing creative ways to network, to sell their products. Now, you may not necessarily see the farmers' faces, but you can still tell that who are producing, and you can be part of the network. And that is a kind of a thing that I'm envisioning, that by looking at small-scale operations in different parts of the world, we can learn from that, and we can also learn what went wrong, and from there we can actually make constructive suggestions for alternative strategies.
Do you think that the move to a more global economy and larger corporations is all going to be a big challenge?
Well, we say that globalization has two aspects that we anthropologists as a whole say that. On the one hand, you see that everything is getting homogenized. You see McDonald's everywhere, or Kentucky Fried Chicken. On the other hand, globalization also came with new technologies that, say for example, Facebook, Twitters, internet. These are giving tools for minority groups to communicate with each other and to learn from each other. So in a way, it can actually empower those who were actually in minor voices in the past. So there are two aspects, and I think how we use these two aspects, that's up to us.
Your group project, are you planning to come out with a book?
Well, what we are doing right now is to do a pilot project with the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, which is a national institute in Japan. And I have a pilot project with them. They gave me about $50,000. And I have 1 year to write a full-scale proposal. And I'm hoping that that will go through.
Very good.
And I'm hoping that we can write a book too, of course.
Good. Well, Professor Habu, thank you so much for coming here and telling us about your work. I look forward to reading your work in the future, and it was a great privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for watching. Good night.